Yo, even quicker video this time. Might actually get my first YouTube video under an hour. No, under 20 minutes. Under 10 would be great. So I'm just doing a few quick videos on the most common type of breakout candidate at different positions. I've just done wide receiver where I went into a little bit more depth about what that means, but I'm going to do a quick recap and then look at running backs for 2020 through the prism glass, wide-eyed, weird stare about what happens the most often in an individual season. If a breakout's going to happen, what's the most common just based on draft capital and career year. And then we break down individual players based on what they've done in the NFL or what we think of them from college after that. It's background noise, background information to layer over what you think is going to happen in an individual season. For me, it's given me a better idea of how to shoot for breakout candidates while I'm drafting in a specific year rather than, first round draft capital madness, right? So, all right, let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about, and then we'll look at 2020 players here. All right, so over here somewhere we have breakout. Oh, I didn't format it. Look at that, so unprofessional. Breakout hit rates. Now, to start with, I'm just using having your first season in the top 24, that's your breakout season. So you can see that draft capital drastically matters. It's organized by this. And just look at one example of it. All right, so drafted in the first round, running backs hit in the top 24 about 84% of the time. They hit and the top 24 at least once, 51% of the time drafted from the second round, 47% of the time drafted from the third round, fourth round, fifth round, and you can see how the numbers start to dwindle. Draft capital definitely matters, but what does that mean when we're talking about a player, individual player going into individual season? Well, breakout timers tend to struggle for a lot of reasons. One, mainly because of sample size. Let's go back to running backs. Not that many players break out, frankly. And so when you're looking at the breakout rates, so the percentage of players that break out in their first year, in their second year, in their third year, and then do it by draft capital as well, you get some pretty good hit rates and context to apply to individual players for a season. But where there are so few that hit, especially at wide receiver, but also at running back, it's difficult to know how well this works as a timer. For example, if we look at players drafted 7th, 6th, 5th overall in those rounds, we see these startlingly high hit rates. And that's because of the simple fact that not many break out. So in the specific career year that 2 of them happen to break out, or 3 out of 5 or whatever, they get these high breakout rates. And so it can be hard to see in context when applying it or comparing it to those being drafted in the first and second round and third year. So what I did overall is calculate, based on draft round and career year, what's the most common type of breakout we see in an individual season since 2007? Okay. So 13% of all running back breakouts into the top 24 happen from first round draft capital running backs in their first year. Second round draft capital running backs also in their first year. And the third category is third round running backs in their first year. So you can see how first year has a lot to do with when running backs break out. We want a lot of early running backs because that's when most of them break out. It's the most common type of breakout. However, you do also see that it separates out in career year and draft capital over the years. So we can see what are the most common type of breakouts in a single season. But memorizing these is tiresome and somewhat boring. So instead, what we want to do is apply that to actual players so we can get an idea of what this actually means, what's the background context. And that's what I've done here. I inputted the breakout rate, the rate at which breakouts happen in an individual career year, and then their positional hit rate, so the percentage of players from that draft round that actually break out. So lots of players who are drafted in the third round, for example, break out in year 3, but where's the draft capital? Can't see it. Undrafted free agents don't break out a lot. 6% of all breakouts actually are only accounted for by players that were undrafted. So to put that into context, what we can do is sort by the commonality. How common are these breakouts in the NFL. And for some reason, I've got it sorted a weird way. I must have been looking at something else. Hang on, bear with me. All right, there we go. So running backs, the most common type of breakout, we know already, is first-round draft capital running backs going into their first year. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire would be the most common type of running back to break out in the 2021 season. What follows from what we already looked at the Commons breakout rates just in this table here, is that all those first and second round running backs, Cam Akers, DeAndre Swift, even A.J. Dillon, J.K. Dobbins, saying nothing about the player, but just the fact they're going into their first year with first and second round draft capital means they're actually in a very common type of hit rate situation, shall we call it, all the way down to Jonathan Taylor. These aren't ranked. It doesn't tell you who's more or less likely to break out from this group. It just tells you that the most common type of breakout would be Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Second most common would be those running backs drafted this year in the second round. That gives us hope for all these great college running backs we really have a lot of hope for, and A.J. Dillon. All right, the next most common category is the 7% rate. So 7% of all breakouts that happen in an individual season, or in any given season, rather. Third-round running backs going into their first year. The first year matters a lot in terms of commonality of breakouts. So you've got Keyshawn Vaughn, Zach Moss, Darrington Evans, and Antonio Gibson. And all of what we think about those players can get built on top of that commonality to the breakout. So what if we take out first-year players, because everyone likes new players, right? We've got draft running back fever going on. Well, actually, the most common breakout to happen outside of rookie fever and new players enter for the first time going to the NFL as running backs are actually undrafted free agents going into their third season. And you can see them all here. Philip Lindsay is actually already broken out. So how about we limit to players that haven't broken out before, just to get a sense of who might be a good value. Hey, that was the wrong way around. Apologize. All right, so you got Reggie Bonafide, Mike Boone, Gus Edwards, Jeff Wilson, Dontrell Hilliard. Now, obviously, some of those guys just are not on anyone's radar for very good reason. Over here, we can see their target share, but not much else about them. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But it is interesting that undrafted free agents going into their third season actually have a fairly strong commonality. That's a very common type of breakout compared to others. More common, in fact, than more popular breakout candidates like Devin Singletary, Darrell Henderson, Alexander Madison, Damian Harris on the Chiefs, in New England, even Sony Michel and Rashad Penny. We still have lingering hope because of that high hit rate from first-round running backs that we're now applying to Clyde Edwards-Helaire, for example. So this doesn't tell you how well the player is, how likely the player is likely to break out. It just gives you a sense of how likely or how often or how common that type of breakout would be compared to all seasons going back to 2007. It adds interesting context. Now, unlike with wide receiver, there's not a lot else I can add to this. Target share doesn't help out a lot either. But Blair Andrews' work over at RotoWiz, which I mentioned in the wide receiver videos too, has shown consistently that if you get somewhat expected opportunity, so it's not based on nothing, you were touching the ball more than a couple of times, and I think his threshold is like 50 expected points, which is an opportunity metric over there at RotoViz. Anyway, he points out that efficient players are more likely to get more opportunity, especially early in their career, which applies almost double for running backs because most running backs do the majority of their production early. So what I did is basically replicate some of his research and look at who was efficient over a certain volume threshold, and not just overall. That would be this column here. So you see Miles Sanders, Josh Jacobs, Devin Singletary, Tony Pollard, and these two guys who, honestly, I think I've seen their names, but I've got no idea who they are. But they've played in 6 games, and they got 13 and 28 expected points overall. So they really aren't crossing that expected point threshold or opportunity threshold. Either way, they were efficient overall. And as was David Montgomery, by the way, but he cycled out of this list for a few other reasons. However, what Blair Andrews was pointing out is that players who are efficient, so fantasy points over expected in the receiving game, specifically in the receiving game, still might be getting undervalued in drafts. And he pointed out that Tony Pollard is one of these players that crossed the opportunity threshold. So he got 71 expected points, was efficient overall, but specifically was very efficient in the receiving game. And so that's the play he pointed out as a potentially underdrafted breakout candidate. Now, Tony Pollard, if I can skip back over to here. Tony Pollard as a breakout candidate just based on his draft year and his draft capital actually has a 4% commonality. 4% of breakouts actually happen at the running back position when they are fourth round draft picks going into their second year. So he falls below some of those players we're looking at, about Singletary and everyone else. But I do think he's in an interesting range of breakout candidates once you consider that the highest category or the most common breakout is only 13%. And then we have several players that, we nothing basically in these 6% categories. David Montgomery is an interesting category. This 5% common breakout. And I'll point out he was efficient in the receiving game. He just wasn't efficient overall, which is what cycled off that list that I took a picture of and just showed you. And Tony Pollard shows up the likes of Rashad Penny and Sony Michel, who I do think might have somewhat of a rebirth. Penny and Michel have both been good when they've been on the field getting opportunity, but for injury concerns with Sony Michel and also, Chris Carson being good concerns with Rashad Penny, that hasn't happened a lot. Tony Pollard shows up in this group in terms of how common the breakout is. And I think he's a sleeper everyone knows about. But it does give you a way to give value Alexander Madison a little more because that draft round just gives him slightly more common breakout history. Dalvin Cook is ahead of him though, but Zeke is ahead of Tony Pollard. So I would put Alexander Madison ahead of Tony Pollard just because that's a breakout that just simply happens more often. But in neither case, we're probably looking at an injury. It is interesting that Alexander Madison got more opportunity overall, but Tony Pollard was efficient in this thing that's undervalued according to Bill Williams, according to Draft Capital, which is efficiency specifically in the receiving game. Anyway, I just thought those were some interesting names that showed up in that 4% category at running back. Where's my mouse? I've lost it. Okay. So if you're interested in seeing that data, all data, any data, my databases are pinned to my timeline on Twitter and also on Patreon. Also, I have a Patreon. Hate to mention it, but mine's free. Support is welcome and encouraged because support's cool. And I like $1. But if not, it's okay. I'm just trying to have fun and add value to the community. So check it out. Links below, everything else. If this video was, in fact, just like this video anyway. I guess I meant to ask you to do that, or don't. I just don't care. So yeah, hopefully it was useful, interesting in some way, or seeing a man who really shouldn't wear red, wearing red just to promote the Scott Fish Bowl. Maybe that was interesting. I don't know. If you stuck through it with all 11 minutes, I really appreciate it. See you again next time. Bye.